Not exactly relevant but still creepy AF. My dad is a trucker and about 20-some years ago, a woman committed suicide by running out in front of him. He said that every night around the time she died, the cab of his truck would drop a few degrees in temperature and he felt a presence. He said this went on for a few weeks and finally he spoke out to her and said he forgave her and wished that she had peace. He said he never experienced the eeriness again. This question is posted on Ask Reddit by user LucasDay88. Truck drivers, what's a creepy story you've got from the middle of nowhere? Not exactly creepy but definitely terrifying. My father was a truck driver and he was driving through a smaller town in Northern California hauling tomatoes. Suddenly he got incredibly tired. Wasn't low on sleep, or deprived at all but ended up passing out at the wheel. Last thing he saw was the light of the town in front of him. He woke up about 2 hours later on the other side of town, perfectly parked on the side of the road. He swears something was looking out for him that night. The obligatory not a truck driver but a second-hand story I heard. My great-uncle drove big trucks, living in the middle of nowhere. Sometimes people would leave trash on the road. And since he had a big truck he'd just smash into said boxes or paper and continue on. One day he was coming up on a cardboard box and just had the urge to swerve and miss this one. He misses it and passes by with no incident, looks in his rear view to look at the box and out pops a kindergarten-age little kid that just heads back to their house as nothing happened. Not sure if this story is creepy but it's definitely scary. My father was a truck driver in East Africa in the 80s and early 90s. During the years leading up to the Rwandan genocide, my father was passing through Rwanda. He reached a checkpoint and was forcibly removed from his truck at gunpoint. Apparently he looked like he belonged to the Tutsi tribe and they put him in a cage with other Tutsi prisoners. He tried communicating that he isn't Rwandan but no one spoke the same language as him. Every night they would take about 5 people from the cage and slaughter them in front of him. After the third night, he saw a man that spoke a little bit of Swahili, which my dad spoke, and told him that he's not Rwandan and showed him his ID. Somehow that guy got him out and he was handed the keys to his truck and was on his way. Around 2006-ish I was driving flatbed, picked up a load of construction material, drywall, roofing, don't remember but it was pre-packaged in boxes and I remember having to use strap protectors on the load, in rural Tennessee. My memory is foggy now but I want to say it was between Memphis and Nashville but closer to the intersection of the Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee state lines. Tarp required so I strapped everything down, tarped the load and left the shipper. About 5 miles down the road, in the middle of nowhere woods on a 2-lane road, I noticed my tarp flapping in the wind. Found a wide shoulder and pulled over to fix it. I realized that I just flat did a shitty job tarping this load and decided to redo it on the side of the road. Undo all the bungee straps, drag the tarps off, roll them back up, climb up on the load and start unrolling the tarps again and I see a guy walking down the same side of the road I am on, coming towards my truck. I don't think anything about it other than to keep an eye on him cause I'm in the middle of nowhere and continue what I am doing. About the time I have tarps set in place and am climbing down to start hooking the bungee straps back on, This dude is getting close enough that I am now paying more attention to him than I am to tarping my load. I grab my winch bar and set it on the driller where I am working just in case. 8-pound solid metal bar about 4 feet long tapered to a blunt point on one end and hollow on the other, used for tightening straps and chains, etc. The guy gets to me and the first thing I notice is his hair. It's like a mullet but it's patchy as fuck. Like he tried to cut his own hair and had a seizure in the process and said fuck it, good enough to party. The next thing I notice were his eyes, which I can only describe as off. Like they were clear. I didn't think he was drunk or high or anything, but it also gave me the distinct impression that the elevator didn't go all the way up. Clothes were dirty and not well maintained, with dirty white tennis shoes, cause I remember he didn't have laces on one shoe and the tongue was noticeably out of place. He stops by me, waits until I acknowledge him and just says I've got a long walk. I am like, yeah man, you do, we're in the middle of nowhere. Making it clear there's no ride to be had here. He nods, starts walking by me, continuing on his way, stops at about the driver door on my truck and turns around, comes back to me and repeats himself. I've got a long walk. At this point I explain that I can't give him a ride, insurance and all that. Apologize for not being able to help him out, and he seems to accept this, turns around and leaves. I wait for him to get a little ways away from my truck and start working on finishing the tarp job. I still keep an eye on him and he's moving away from me. As I am putting on the last of the bungee straps, I look over to check where he's at and he's turned around heading back towards me, now about 100 yards in front of my truck and coming back my way. It looks like he's talking on a cell phone, has his hand up to his face and I can barely make out his mouth moving, his other hand waving like he's having a conversation with someone. I finish with the straps, grab my winch bar, and am climbing into my truck as he's about 10 yards away now. Soon as I am in the cab I lock the doors, and set the winch bar on the passenger seat just in case. I look at the guy and realize he's not talking on a phone, he's talking to his fucking hand, and now I'm nervous, cause he doesn't look like he's having a nice pleasant chat, it looks more like an angry conversation. Crank the truck up, put it in gear and just pull out, didn't look for traffic or anything. As I pass him he's just looking at me, still holding his hand to his face with this dead-ass look on his face, just staring at me. Gave me the creeps. About the time I hit 5th or 6th gear I look in the mirror and there's no one there. Not technically a truck driver, but my cousin works at a truck stop in Kansas. She told me about some guy who parked his truck and got out. A woman got out of the passenger seat. It was kinda cold, so the trucker was wearing a coat and hat. But the woman was wearing summer clothes. My cousin thought nothing of it and did her whole hi welcome in. The trucker bought a coffee but the woman just stood there in the doorway. Now my cousin was freaked out. She didn't want to be rude but she was a teenage girl alone in a gas station in the middle of nowhere. "Excuse me miss, do you need anything?" she asked. "Who are you talking to?" the truck driver asked when he got to the checkout. "The woman who got out of your truck?" My cousin pointed, but the woman had disappeared. She told me she had never seen a look of pure terror on a man's face. He just whispers quietly, "Oh no." Got his coffee and left. The woman did not get back into his truck and my cousin couldn't find her in the store. She says it was one of the most terrifying experiences she had ever had while on that job. My dad drove a truck between Edinburgh and London and tells this story often. He was driving down the motorway and looked to his right, saw a woman with a mistrustful bun, as he describes it, staring at him with a terrified expression from a car next to him. Before he really knows how to react, the car pulls off at the next exit and my dad, although shaken, carries on. About half an hour later, a different car with a different driver pulls alongside my dad, with the same woman in the passenger seat, with the same expression on her face. My dad thinks fuck this and plans to pull into the next services to report, as even if it's nothing, misunderstanding, better to be safe than sorry, right? Anyway, the car disappears before he can get any details, plates etc., and he thinks there is no point calling the police with no details, so he carries on driving. Literally about 4 hours later, almost in London, yet another car pulls alongside him with the same woman. It has the same mistrustful hair, same terrified expression, except this time she appears to be screaming at my dad through the window, so my dad pulls over into a lay-by and calls the police. Apparently they have received 3 other calls about the same woman, car in the same area in the last few minutes. It is unfortunately anticlimactic, as he never heard anything more about it, but he did not see her again, and although he kept an eye on the news, didn't see anything about it. Hopefully it's just a giant coincidence. Who knows? Not me, but my Costa Rican tour guide told us a really scary story that happened to a former employee of his who would drive a truck carrying construction-related shit to different sites. Mind you, where they were building was miles away from the nearest city, a lot of Costa Rica's preserved jungle. Luckily the government is environmentally conscious and isn't just cutting everything down like Brazil is it now. Anyway, this dude was the first, not the only, to have this happen to him. Apparently when he was driving behind a line of construction trucks on their way to the site late at night, he saw a white pale woman throw herself in the way of the trucks in front of him. He yelled it into the radio to stop and check for her, but when they stopped they didn't find a body, blood, and no one saw her except him. This happened again on the same trip, and yet again, when they stopped they couldn't find the girl and no one except the guy who called it saw anything. The other workers thought he was high or something. One other time he had to go out to the site by himself, at night. It had been some time after the incident with the pale woman, so he didn't think it was a big deal. He exited the car at one point to take a leak near a clearing, and that's when he felt it started to get really cold. He turned around, and peering out from a tree in the distance he saw the same pale woman staring at him. Dude booked it back to his car and got in the driver's seat, turned it on, and was about to speed the F out when he took one last look at his left side rearview mirror and saw her much closer and still looking at him. He kept that story to himself, thinking no one would believe him, until a new worker claimed to see the same thing and told my tour guide, their boss. When the boss told the truck driver what the new guy saw, the truck driver told him about the second encounter with the woman in the forest. Creepy shit. Edit, fucked up, he drove the car the second time, not a truck. I was driving an 18-wheeler flammable tanker in the middle of New Mexico, and these 2 brunettes started to pass me in a green convertible. They drove directly parallel to me, not passing, and signaled for me to pull over. We happened to be coming up on an abandoned service station, so I figured what the hell, and swung around and got out of the cab. They stayed in their car but jumped up on the back of their seats and waved for me to come over. I cautiously start approaching on foot. When I was maybe 10 yards away, they start hollering at me, "Are you gonna apologize? Didn't your mama ever teach you not to do things like that?" And I say, "What do you mean?" Then suddenly the one wearing a cowboy hat pulls the revolver she was packing in her belt, and starts shooting towards my rig. She punctured 2 tires, then before you know it she hits the tanker, which explodes into a fireball directly next to the desolate highway. If that wasn't crazy enough, they immediately start the car and start driving circles around me, then speed away, back down the highway. Before too long a sheriff's chopper showed up, and apparently after that pursued them with a dozen state troopers, ultimately cornering them on the edge of the Grand Canyon. Rather than be taken in for questioning, the 2 floored it and drove their T-Bird straight over the edge of the canyon. That was hands down the scariest moment of my adult life, but at least I can say those 2 taught me a very important lesson that day. Not a truck driver, but this story involves a truck driver. When I was in my 20s I decided to head out across the country on a big adventure. I had a vague plan that eventually I would make it to California, but I ran into several detours and problems along the way. Eventually I just had to start hitchhiking cause I had lost my wheels. One night on this lonely patch of road I was finally able to flag down a truck for a ride. I felt lucky cause it was a pretty foggy night and I didn't want to get stuck sleeping on the side of the road. I'd had some kind of rough times on the trip before this, so I was pretty relieved when I saw that the driver was an older lady that seemed pretty harmless. Well, we get going down the road a bit and things started to get kind of weird. She starts telling me a story about how 10 years prior on the same stretch of road there was a pretty nasty accident that resulted in fatalities. She was pretty graphic about it and it pretty much creeped me out, so when I saw lights to a diner coming up I told her to just drop me off there. As I'm climbing out of the truck she tells me her name and says to let the people running the diner know that she sent me. I figured maybe she drove that stretch of highway a lot and so stopped there often and it might get me a discount or something. I walk into the place, the Wheeler Inn. I'll never forget that name. It's one of those places where everyone turns and looks at you cause you're not a local. Anyways, I say Large Marge sent me. The room goes completely quiet and everyone is just staring at me. This one guy speaks up and says that impossible. I was standing there all confused cause I'm sure that is what the lady said her name was, but maybe they know her by a different name. Then this other guy speaks up and says that the accident 10 years ago from that very night involved Large Marge and she died in the fiery wreck. They even had a memorial up on the wall of the diner for her. Shook me to the core and still does to this day. Not me, but my friend's hubby was a truck driver and she shared this with me. He was driving through rural Montana really early in the morning when a guy on a motorcycle passed him. A few minutes later he could see sparks ahead of him, so he figured the motorcycle guy had had an accident. He did, but it was so awful. He'd hit a deer while going 70 plus. I don't want to go into specifics, but his injuries were as devastating as you could imagine, but he was still alive and conscious when friend's hubby got to him. He begged friend's hubs to call his wife and kids so he could say goodbye. Friend's hubs sat there with him and held his hand until the end. The police took forever to get there because it was so rural. It really messed with his mind. The state wanted to give him an accommodation but he refused. He just wanted to forget it. I posted this somewhere else recently, but it fits better here. I used to deliver hotshot freight across the Great Plains / Minnesota area. One night around 2 a.m. I was hauling across North Dakota trying to reach Montana by morning. I was delivering a particularly valuable tractor part that a farm desperately needed for the following day. I began to notice some highway hypnosis sneaking up on me, but it didn't really bother me because I'd been through it hundreds of times before. Anyone who has driven across North Dakota knows that it is incredibly flat. Like, really flat. There also tends to be very straighter and long roads. It's somewhat easy to see things on the road that are far away, even at night. I noticed something long on the road, spanning my entire lane, approximately half a mile in front of me. I slowed down a little and prepared to move into the opposite lane, thinking it was some retread off a blown tire. As I got closer I noticed it was two people, laying head to toe across the entire lane. I swerved into the other lane, successfully avoiding them and came to an almost complete stop. But they didn't move. Not an inch. I was just about to back up and check on them when I remembered a story that an old graybeard colleague of mine told me. He told me that in certain remote areas, people will lie down in the middle of the road and wait for a car or truck to stop and see what's going on. At that point, the road layers along with whoever else is hiding in the nearby bushes will beat the shit out of the driver and steal his vehicle, leaving him in the middle of nowhere. I decided not to back up, and when the two people in the road saw me put my truck back in gear and drive away, they both got up and walked toward the shoulder. I called the police and explained what happened, but we were so far away from civilization that I doubt anything came of it. Thanks to that old graybeard, I got to keep my truck, my job, and my teeth.